Beethoven. 1. Youth in Bonn, 1770 to 1792. He was born on December 16, 1770. Bonn was the seat of the Prince Archbishop Elector of Cologne, one of those Rhineland principalities which, before Napoleon secularized them, were ruled by Catholic archbishops engagingly secular and inclined to support well-behaved artists. A considerable part of Bonn's 9,560 population was dependent upon the electoral establishment. Beethoven's grandfather was a bass singer in the elector's choir. His father, Johann van Beethoven, was a tenor there. The family, of Dutch stock, had come from a village near Louvain. The Dutch van indicated place of origin and did not, like the German von or the French de, indicate titled and propertied nobility. Grandfather and father were inclined to excessive drinking, and something of this passed down to the composer. In the year 1767, Johann van Beethoven married the young widow Maria Magdalena Kverik-Leim, daughter of a cook in Ehrenbreitstein. She developed into a mother much beloved by her famous son for her soft heart and easy ways. She gave her husband 7 children, 4 of whom died in infancy. The survivors were the brothers Ludwig, Caspar Karl, 1774 to 1815, and Nikolaus Johann, 1776 to 1848. The father's salary of 300 florins as electoral court tenorist was apparently his sole income. The family lived in a poor quarter of Bonn, and the young Beethoven's surroundings and associations were not of a kind to make him a gentleman. He remained a rough-hewn rebel to the end. Hoping to improve the family income by developing a son into a child prodigy, Beethoven's father induced or compelled the 4-year-old boy to practice at the clavier or on the violin many hours in the day, occasionally at night. Apparently the boy had no spontaneous urge to music, and according to divers witnesses, he had to be urged on by a severe discipline that sometimes brought him to tears. The torture succeeded, and the boy came to love the art that had cost him so many painful hours. At the age of 8, with another pupil, he was displayed in a public concert, March 26, 1778, with financial results unrecorded. In any case, the father was encouraged to engage teachers who could lead Ludwig into the higher subtleties of music. Aside from this, he received little formal education. We hear of his attending a school where he learned enough Latin to salt some of his letters with humorous Latin inventions. He picked up enough French, which was the Esperanto of the time, to write it intelligibly. He never learned to spell correctly in any language and seldom bothered to punctuate. But he read some good books, ranging from Scots novels to Persian poetry, and copied into his notebooks morsels of wisdom from his reading. His only sport was in his fingers. He loved to improvise, and in that game only Abt Vogler could match him. In 1784, Maria Theresa's youngest son, Maximilian Francis, was appointed Elector of Cologne and took up his residence in Bonn. He was a kindly man, enthusiastic about food and music. He became the fattest man in Europe, but also he brought together an orchestra of 31 pieces. Beethoven, aged 14, played the viola in that ensemble and was also listed as deputy court organist, with a salary of 150 gulden per year. A report to the elector in 1785 described him as of good capability, of good quiet behavior, and poor. Despite some evidence of sexual ventures, the good behavior and growing competence of the youth led to his receiving from the elector in 1787 permission and funds for a trip to Vienna for instruction in musical composition. Soon after his arrival, he was received by Mozart, who heard him play and praised him with disappointing moderation, apparently thinking that the piece had been long rehearsed. Suspecting this suspicion, Beethoven asked Mozart to give him on the piano a theme for variations. Mozart was astonished at the youth's fertility of invention and sureness of touch, and said to his friends, "Keep your eyes on him. Some day he will give the world something to talk about." But this story has too familiar an air. Mozart appears to have given the boy some lessons, but the death of Mozart's father, Leopold, on May 28, 1787, and news that Beethoven's mother was dying, cut this relationship short. Ludwig hurried back to Bonn and was at his mother's bedside when she died on July 17th. The father, whose tenor voice had long since decayed, wrote to the Elector, describing his extreme poverty and appealing for help. No answer is recorded, but another singer in the choir came to the rescue. In 1788, Ludwig himself added to the family income by giving piano lessons to Eleonora von Breuning and her brother Lawrence. Their widowed, wealthy, cultured mother received the young teacher into full equality with her children, and the friendships so formed helped in some measure to smooth the sharp corners of Beethoven's character. Helpful, too, was the kindness of Count Ferdinand von Waldstein, 1762 to 1823, himself a good musician and a close friend of the Elector. Learning of Beethoven's poverty, he sent him occasional gifts of money, pretending that they were from the Elector. Beethoven later dedicated to him the piano sonata, Opus 53 in C major, that bears his name. Ludwig needed help more than ever now, for his despondent father had surrendered to alcohol and had been with difficulty rescued from arrest as a public nuisance. In 1789, Beethoven, not yet 19, took upon himself the responsibility for his younger brothers and became legal head of the family. A decree of the Elector, on November 20th, ordered that the services of Johann van Beethoven should be dispensed with, and that half of his annual salary of 200 Reichsthalers should be paid him and the other half to his eldest son. Beethoven continued to earn a small sum as chief pianist and second organist in the Elector's orchestra. In 1790, flush with a triumph in London, Franz Joseph Haydn stopped at Bonn on his way home to Vienna. Beethoven presented to him a cantata that he had recently composed. Haydn praised it. Probably some word of this reached the Elector's ear. He listened favorably to suggestions that he allow the youth to go to Vienna for study with Haydn and to continue for some months to receive his salary as a musician on the Elector's staff. Probably Count von Waldstein had won this boon for his young friend. He wrote in Ludwig's album a farewell note. "Dear Beethoven, you are traveling to Vienna in fulfillment of your long-cherished wish. The genius of Mozart," who had died on December 5, 1791, "is still weeping and bewailing the death of her favorite. Labor assiduously and receive Mozart's spirit from the hands of Haydn. Your true friend, Waldstein." Beethoven left Bonn, father, family, and friends, on or about November 1st, 1792. Soon afterward, French revolutionary troops occupied Bonn, and the Elector fled to Mainz. Beethoven never saw Bonn again. 2. Progress and Tragedy, 1792 to 1802. Arrived in Vienna, he found the city alive with musicians competing for patrons, audiences, and publishers, looking askance at every newcomer and finding no disarming beauty in the youth from Bonn. He was short, stocky, dark-complexioned, Anton Esterhazy called him the Moor, pock-marked, front upper teeth overlapping the lower, nose broad and flat, eyes deep-set and challenging, and head like a bullet, wearing a wig and a van. He was not designed for popularity with either the public or his competitors, but he was rarely without a rescuing friend. Soon came news that his father had died on December 18, 1792. Some difficulty having developed about Beethoven's share in his father's small annuity, he petitioned the Elector for its continuance. The Elector responded by doubling it, and added, "He is further to receive 3 measures of grain for the education of his brothers," Karl and Johann, who had moved to Vienna. Beethoven, grateful, made some good resolutions. In a friend's album, May 22, 1793, he wrote, using the words of Schiller's Don Carlos, "I am not wicked. Hot blood is my fault. My crime is that I am young. Even though wildly surging emotions may betray my heart, yet my heart is good." He resolved to do good wherever possible, to love liberty above all else, never to deny the truth, even before the throne. He kept his expenditures to a stoic minimum. For December 1792, 14 florins for rent, 6 florins for rent of a piano, eating each time 12 kreutzer, meals with wine 6.5 florins. Another memorandum lists Haydn at various times as costing 2 groschen, a few cents. Apparently Haydn was asking little for his lessons. For a while, the student accepted correction humbly, but as the lessons continued, Haydn found it impossible to accept Beethoven's reported deviations from orthodox rules of composition. Toward the end of 1793, Beethoven quit his aging master and went 3 times a week to study counterpoint with a man more famous as teacher than as composer, Johann Georg Albrechtsberger. Concurrently, 3 times a week, he studied violin with Ignaz Schuppanzig. In 1795, having taken all that he felt need of from Albrechtsberger, he applied to Antonio Salieri, then director of the Vienna Opera, for instruction in composition for the voice. Salieri charged nothing to poor pupils. Beethoven presented himself as such and was accepted. All 4 of these teachers found him a difficult disciple, bursting with ideas of his own, and resenting the formalism of the musical theory offered him. We can imagine the shudders generated in Papa Haydn, who lived till 1809, by the irregularities and sonorities of Beethoven's compositions. Despite, perhaps because of, his deviations from traveled roads, Beethoven's performances won him, by 1794, a reputation as the most interesting pianist in Vienna. The pianoforte had won its battle with the harpsichord. Johann Christian Bach in 1768 had begun performing solos on it in England. Mozart adopted it. Haydn followed suit in 1780. Muzio Clementi was composing concertos definitely designed for the piano and its new flexibility between piano and forte, between staccato and sostenuto. Beethoven made full use of the piano's powers and his own, especially in his improvisations, where no printed notation hampered his style. Ferdinand Ries, pupil of both Haydn and Beethoven, later declared, "No artist that I ever heard came at all near the height which Beethoven attained in this branch of playing. The wealth of ideas which forced themselves on him, the caprices to which he surrendered himself, the variety of treatment, the difficulties were inexhaustible." It was as a pianist that the patrons of music first appreciated him. At an evening concert in the home of Baron van Swieten, after the program had been completed, the host, biographer Schindler relates, detained Beethoven and persuaded him to add a few fugues of Bach as an evening blessing. Prince Karl Lichnowsky, the leading amateur musician in Vienna, so liked Beethoven that he regularly engaged him for his Friday musicales, and for a time entertained him as a house guest. Beethoven, however, could not adjust himself to the prince's meal hours and preferred a nearby hotel. The most enthusiastic of the composer's titled patrons was Prince Lobkowitz, an excellent violinist, who spent nearly all his income on music and musicians. For years he helped Beethoven, despite quarrels, and he took in good spirit Beethoven's insistence on being treated as a social equal. The ladies of these helpful nobles enjoyed his proud independence, took lessons and scoldings from him, and allowed the poor bachelor to make love to them in letters. They and their lords accepted his dedications and rewarded him moderately. So far, his fame was only as a pianist, and as such it reached Prague and Berlin, to which he made visits as a virtuoso in 1796. But meanwhile he composed. On October 21st, 1795, he published, as his Opus 1, 3 grand trios, about which Johann Kramer, after playing them, announced, "This is the man who is to console us for the loss of Beethoven." Stimulated by such praise, Beethoven wrote in his notebook, "Courage! Despite all bodily weaknesses, my spirit shall rule. This year must determine the complete man. Nothing must remain undone." In 1797, Napoleon, unseen, first came into Beethoven's life. The young general, having driven the Austrians from Lombardy, had led his army over the Alps and was nearing Vienna. The surprised capital extemporized defense as well as it could with guns and hymns. Now Haydn wrote Austria's national anthem, "Gott erhalte Franz den Kaiser, unsern guten Kaiser Franz." And Beethoven produced music for another war song, "Ein großes deutsches Volk sind wir." These spirited compositions were later to be worth many regiments, but they did not move Napoleon, who exacted a humiliating peace. A year later, General Bernadotte came to Vienna as the new French ambassador and shocked the citizens by raising from his balcony the French revolutionary tricolor flag. Beethoven, who had frankly expressed republican ideas, openly declared his admiration of Bonaparte and was often seen at the ambassador's receptions. Apparently it was Bernadotte who suggested to Beethoven the idea of a composition honoring Napoleon. Seeking to tap nearer services, Ludwig in 1799 dedicated his Opus 13, Grande Sonate Pathétique, to Prince Lichnowsky in gratitude for favors received or hoped for. The prince responded in 1800 by putting 600 gulden at Beethoven's disposal, "until I obtain a suitable appointment." This sonata began simply, as if in humble filiation from Mozart. Then it proceeded to a difficult intricacy that would later seem simple beside the almost aggressive complexity and power of the Hammerklavier sonatas or the Appassionata. Still easy on eyes and hands were the First Symphony of 1800 and the Moonlight Sonata in C-sharp minor of 1801. Beethoven did not give the latter piece its famous name, but called it Sonata Quasi Fantasia. Apparently he had no intention of making it a love song. It is true that he dedicated it to the Countess Giulia Guicciardi, who was among the untouchable goddesses of his reveries, but it had been written for another occasion, quite unrelated to this divinity. To the year 1802 belongs one of the strangest and most appealing documents in the history of music. This secret Heiligenstadt Testament, which was not seen by others till found in Beethoven's papers after his death, is intelligible only through a frank confrontation of his character. There had been many pleasant qualities in it in his youth, a buoyancy of spirit, a fund of humor, a devotion to study, a readiness to help, and many of his Bonn friends, his teacher Christian Gottlob Nefer, his pupil Eleonora von Breuning, his patron Count von Waldstein, remained devoted to him despite his growing bitterness against life. In Vienna, however, he alienated one friend after another until he was left almost alone. When they heard that he was dying, they came back and did what they could to ease his pains. His early environment scarred him lastingly. He could never forget and never forgive the toilsome, anxious poverty or the humiliation of seeing his father surrender to failure and drink. He himself, as the years saddened him, yielded more and more to the amnesia of wine. In Vienna, his stature, 5 feet 5 inches, invited wit, and his face was no fortune, his hair thick, disheveled, bristling, his heavy beard spreading up to his sunken eyes, and sometimes allowed to grow to half an inch before shaving. "O God," he cried in 1819, "what a plague it is to one when he has so fatal a face as mine." These physical disadvantages were probably a spur to achievement, but after the first few years in Vienna, they discouraged care of his dress, his body, his rooms, or his manners. "I am an untidy fellow," he wrote on April 22, 1801. "Perhaps the only touch of genius which I possess is that my things are not always in very good order." He earned enough to keep servants, but he soon quarreled with them and seldom kept them long. He was brusque with the lowly. With the high-born he was sometimes obsequious, often proud, even arrogant. He was merciless in assessing his rivals, and was rewarded by their almost unanimous dislike. He was severe with his pupils, but taught some of them without charge. He was a misanthrope, judging every man basically base, but fondly forgiving his troublesome nephew Karl, and loving every pretty pupil. He gave to nature the unquestioning affection that he could not offer to mankind. He frequently fell into melancholy moods, but almost as frequently had spells of raucous jollity, with or without wine. He had an often inconsiderate sense of humor, punned at every opportunity, and invented sometimes offensive nicknames for his friends. He could laugh more readily than he could smile. He tried, through worried years, to conceal from the world the affliction that embittered his life. In a letter of June 29, 1801, he revealed it to a friend of his youth, Franz Wegeler. "For the last 3 years my hearing has become weaker and weaker. The trouble is supposed to have been caused by the condition of my abdomen, which was wretched even before I left Bonn, but has become worse in Vienna, where I have been constantly afflicted with diarrhea and have been suffering in consequence from an extraordinary disability. Such was my condition until the autumn of last year, and sometimes I gave way to despair. I must confess that I lead a wretched life. For almost 2 years I have ceased to attend any social functions, just because I find it impossible to say to people, I am deaf. If I had any other profession, I might be able to cope with my infirmity, but in my profession it is a terrible calamity. Heaven alone knows what is to become of me. Already I have cursed my Creator and my existence. I beg you not to say anything about my condition to anyone, not even to Lorcan. Eleonora von Brüning. Apparently in hopes of profiting from its sulfur baths, Beethoven spent part of 1802 in Heiligenstadt, a small village near Göttingen. Wandering in nearby woods, he saw at a short distance a shepherd playing a pipe. As he heard no sound, he realized that now only the louder sounds of an orchestra would reach him. He had already begun to conduct as well as to perform and compose, and the implications of this peasant's unheard pipe threw him into despair. He went into his room and composed, on October 6, 1802, what is known as the Heiligenstadt Testament, a spiritual will and apologia pro vita sua. Though he captioned it, For My Brothers Karl and blank, Beethoven, he carefully concealed the document from all eyes but his own. It is here transcribed in its essential lines. O ye men who think and say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do ye wrong me, you who do not know the secret cause of my seeming so. From childhood my heart and mind were disposed to the gentle feeling of goodwill. I was even ever eager to accomplish great deeds, but reflect now that for 6 years I have been in a hopeless case, aggravated by senseless physicians, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady. Born with an ardent and lively temperament, even susceptible to the diversions of society, I was compelled early to isolate myself, to live in loneliness. When I at times tried to forget all this, oh, how harshly was I repulsed by the doubly sad experience of my bad hearing. And yet it was impossible for me to say to men, speak louder, shout, for I am deaf. Ah, how could I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which should have been more perfect in me than in others? Oh, I cannot do it. Therefore, forgive me when you see me draw back when I would gladly mingle with you. What a humiliation when one stood beside me and heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Such incidents brought me to the verge of despair. But little more and I would have put an end to my life. Only art it was that withheld me. Ah, it seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon to produce. O Divine One, Thou lookest into my inmost soul, and Thou knowest it. Thou knowest that love of man and desire to do good lives therein. O men, when some day you read these words, reflect that ye did me wrong. You, my brothers Karl and blank. As soon as I am dead, if Dr. Schmidt is still alive, ask him in my name to describe my malady and attach this document to the history of my illness, so that so far as possible at least the world may become reconciled with me after my death. At the same time I declare you two to be the heirs of my small fortune. It is my wish that your lives may be better and freer from care than I have had. Recommend virtue to your children. It alone can give happiness, not money. I speak from experience. It was virtue that upheld me in my misery. To it, next to my art, I owe the fact that I did not end my life by suicide. Farewell and love each other. With joy I hasten toward death. In the margin he wrote, to be read and executed after my death. It was not a suicide note. It was both hopeless and resolute. Beethoven proposed to accept and transcend his hardship, and bring to other ears than his own all the music that lay silent within him. Almost at once, still in Heiligenstadt, in November 1802, he composed his second symphony, in D, wherein there is no note of complaint or grief. Only 1 year after his cry from the depths, he composed his third symphony, the Eroica, and entered with it his second and most creative period. 3. The Heroic Years, 1803 to 1809. The learned musicologists who have been trailed in these hesitant pages divide Beethoven's productive career into 3 periods: 1792 to 1802, 1803 to 1816, 1817 to 1824. In the first, he worked tentatively in the simple and placid style of Mozart and Haydn. In the second period, he made greater demands upon the performers in tempo, dexterity, and force. He explored contrasts of mood from tenderness to power. He gave rein to his inventiveness in variation and to his flair for improvisation, but he subjected these to the logic of affiliation and development. He changed the sex of the sonata and the symphony from feminine sentiment and delicacy to masculine assertiveness and will. As if to signalize the change, Beethoven now replaced the minuet in the third movement with a scherzo, frolicking with notes, laughing in the face of fate. Now he found in music an answer to misfortune. He could absorb himself in the creation of music that would make the death of his body a passing incident in an extended life. When I am playing and composing, my affliction hampers me least. He could no longer hear his melodies with his physical ears, but he could hear them with his eyes, with the musician's secret ability to transfer imagined notes into spots and lines of ink, and then hear them soundless from the printed pages. Almost all the works of this period became classics, appearing through succeeding generations in orchestral repertoires. The Kreutzer Sonata, Opus 47, composed in 1803 for violinist George Bridgetower, was dedicated to Rudolf Kreutzer, teacher of the violin in the Paris Conservatory of Music. Beethoven had met him in Vienna in 1798. Kreutzer judged the piece alien to his style or mood and seems never to have played it publicly. Beethoven ranked as the best of his symphonies the Eroica, composed in 1803 to 1804. Half the world knows the story about its original dedication to Napoleon. Despite his titled friends and judicious dedications, Beethoven remained to the end of his life a resolute Republican, and he applauded the seizure and reconstitution of the French government by Bonaparte in 1799 to 1800 as a move toward responsible rule. In 1802, however, he expressed his regret that Napoleon had signed a concordat with the Church. Now, he wrote, everything is going back to the old track. As to the dedication, let an eyewitness, Ferdinand Ries, tell the tale. In this symphony, Beethoven had Bonaparte in his mind, but as he was when he was first consul. Beethoven esteemed him greatly at the time, and likened him to the greatest Roman consuls. I, as well as several of his more intimate friends, saw a copy of the Eroica score lying upon his table, with the word Buonaparte at the extreme top of the title page, and at the extreme bottom Luigi van Beethoven, but not another word. I was the first to bring him the intelligence that Bonaparte had proclaimed himself emperor, whereupon he flew into a rage and cried out, "Is then he too nothing more than an ordinary human being? Now he will trample on all the rights of man and indulge only his ambition. He will exalt himself above all others, become a tyrant." Beethoven went to the table, took hold of the title page by the top, tore it in two, and threw it on the floor. The first page was rewritten, and only then did the symphony receive the title Symphonia Eroica. When the symphony was published in 1805, it bore the title Heroic Symphony to Celebrate the Memory of a Great Man. It received its first public performance April 7, 1805, in the Theater an der Wien. Beethoven conducted despite his defective hearing. His style of conducting accorded with his character. Excitable, demanding, most extravagant. At a pianissimo he would crouch down so as to be hidden by the desk, and then as the crescendo increased, would gradually rise, beating all the time, until at the fortissimo he would spring into the air with his arms extended as if wishing to float on the clouds. The symphony was criticized for strange modulations and violent transitions, undesirable originality, and excessive length. The critic advised Beethoven to go back to his earlier and simpler style. Beethoven winced and growled and worked on. Giving another hostage to fortune, he tried his hand at opera. On November 20th, 1805, he conducted the premiere of Leonora. But Napoleon's troops had occupied Vienna on November 13th. The Emperor Francis and the leading nobles had fled. The citizens were in no mood for opera. The performance was a resounding failure, despite the applause of the French officers in the scanty audience. Beethoven was told that his opera was too long and clumsily arranged. He shortened and revised it and offered it a second time on March 29, 1806. Again it failed. 8 years later, when the city teamed with the Congress of Vienna, the opera, renamed Fidelio, was given a third trial and achieved a moderate success. Beethoven's mode of composition had become attuned to instruments with greater range and flexibility than the human voice. The singers, however anxious to break new barriers, simply could not sing some soaring passages, and at last they rebelled. The opera is occasionally staged today, borne on the wings of the composer's fame, and with revisions that he can no longer revise. From that difficult and unrewarding experience, he passed on to one masterpiece after another. In 1805, he presented Piano Concerto in G, No. 4, Opus 58, second only to the fifth in the affection of virtuosos. He celebrated the year 1806 with the Sonata in F minor, Opus 57, later christened Appassionata, and added 3 quartets, Opus 59, dedicated to Count Andreas Razumovsky, Russian ambassador at Vienna. In March 1807, Beethoven's friends, probably to console him for the failure of his opera, organized a benefit concert for him. There he conducted his symphonies No. 1, 2, and 3, the Eroica, and his new symphony No. 4 in B-flat, Opus 60. We are not told how the audience bore up under this surfeit. In 1806, Prince Miklos Nikolaus Esterházy commissioned Beethoven to compose a mass for the name day of his wife. Beethoven went to the Esterházy Chateau at Eisenstadt in Hungary and presented there his Mass in C, Opus 86, on September 13, 1807. After the performance, the prince asked him, "But my dear Beethoven, what is this you have done again?" Beethoven interpreted the question as expressing dissatisfaction, and he left the chateau before his invitation had run out. He signalized 1808 with 2 symphonies now known throughout the world, Symphony No. 5 in C minor, and the 6th or Pastoral Symphony in F. They appear to have been composed concurrently through several years in alternations of mood between the brooding of the 5th and the gaiety of the 6th. Fitly, they received their premiere together on December 22, 1808. Frequent repetitions have lessened their charm, even for old music lovers. We are no longer moved by fate knocking at the door or birds warbling in the trees. But perhaps the fading of our enchantment is due to the lack of musical education that might have equipped us to follow with appreciation and pleasure the logic of thematic contrasts and developments, the cooperation of counterpoint, the playful rivalry of different instruments, the dialogue of winds and strings, the mood of each movement, the structure and direction of the whole. Minds are differently molded, some to feelings, some to ideas. It must have been as hard for Hegel to understand Beethoven as for Beethoven, or anyone, to understand Hegel. In 1808 to 1809, he composed the Piano Concerto No. 5 in E-flat, Opus 73, known as The Emperor. Of all his works, this is the most lovable, the most enduringly beautiful, the one of which we never tire. However often we have heard it, we are moved beyond words by its sparkling vivacity, its gay inventiveness, its inexhaustible fountains of feeling and delight. In this concerto, a man rising triumphantly out of apparent disaster wrote an ode to joy far more convincing than the stentorian chorus of the Ninth Symphony. Perhaps the happiness of the Emperor Concerto and the Pastoral Symphony reflected Beethoven's increasing prosperity. In 1808, he had been engaged as piano teacher by Archduke Rudolph, the youngest son of the Emperor Francis. So began a friendship that often helped the increasingly discreet Republican. In 1808, he received a flattering offer from Jérôme Bonaparte, King of Westphalia, to come and serve as Kapellmeister in the royal choir and orchestra at Kassel. Beethoven agreed to fill the post at 600 gold ducats per year. Apparently, he still had some faith in his dying years. When word spread that he was negotiating with Kassel, his friends protested against what they called disloyalty to Vienna. He answered that he had toiled there for 16 years without receiving a secure position. On February 26, 1809, the Archduke sent him a formal agreement by which, in return for Beethoven's remaining in Vienna, he would be guaranteed an annual sum of 4,000 florins, of which Rudolph would pay 1,500, Prince Lobkowitz 700, and Count Kinsky 1,800. In addition, Beethoven might keep whatever he earned. He accepted and stayed. In that year, 1809, Papa Haydn died, and and Beethoven inherited his crown. 4. The lover. Having achieved economic stability, he returned to his lifelong quest for a wife. He was a warmly sexual man. Presumably he found a variety of outlets, but he had long felt the need for a permanent companionship. In Bonn, according to his friend Wegeler, he was always loving. In 1801 he mentioned to Wegeler, "A dear sweet girl who loves me and whom I love." This is generally supposed to have been his 17-year-old pupil, Countess Giulia Guicciardi. However, she married Count Gallenberg. In 1805, Beethoven centered his hopes upon the widowed Countess Josephine von Thym, to whom he sent a passionate declaration. "Here I give you a solemn promise that in a short time I shall stand before you more worthy of myself and of you. Oh, if only you would attach some value to this. I mean to founding my happiness by means of your love. Oh, beloved Josephine, it is no desire for the other sex that draws me near to you. It is just you, your whole self, with all your individual qualities. This has compelled my regard. This has bound all my feelings, all my emotional power to you. You make me hope that your heart will long beat for me. Mine can only cease to beat for you when it no longer beats." Apparently the lady turned to other prospects. 2 years later, Beethoven was still appealing to be admitted to her presence. She did not reply. In March 1807, he paid such devout attentions to Madame Marie Bigot that her husband protested. Beethoven sent "Dear Maria, dear Bigot," a letter of apology, declaring, "It is one of my chief principles never to be in any other relationship with the wife of another man than that of friendship." On March 14, 1809, expecting to be in Freiburg, he wrote to Baron von Gleichenstein, "Now you can help me to look for a wife. Indeed, you might find some beautiful girl at Freiburg who would perhaps now and then grant a side to my harmonies. If you do find one, please form the connection in advance. But she must be beautiful, for it is impossible for me to love anything that is not beautiful, or else I should have to love myself." But this was presumably one of Beethoven's jokes. More serious was his affair with Teresa Malfatti. She was another of his pupils, daughter of a distinguished physician. A letter to her of May 8, 1810, has some of the air of an accepted lover. On May 2nd, Beethoven had sent an urgent request to Wegeler, then at Koblenz, to go to Bonn and locate and send him the composer's baptismal certificate. "For I have been said to be older than I am." Wegeler complied. Beethoven made no acknowledgment, and in July, Stefan von Breuning wrote to Wegeler, "I believe his marriage project has fallen through, and for this reason he no longer feels the lively desire to thank you for your trouble." Till his 40th year, he insisted that he had been born in 1772. The baptismal certificate gave his birth year as 1770. After his death, 3 letters were found in a locked drawer, which are among the most tender and fervent love letters in history. They were never sent. As they name, no year, and no address, they remain a mystery that has produced its own literature. The first letter, dated July 6th in the morning, tells of Beethoven's hectic 3-day trip from Vienna to a woman in an unstated place in Hungary. Some phrases. "My angel, my all, my very self. Can our love endure except through sacrifices, except through not demanding everything? Can you change it that you are not wholly mine, I not wholly thine? O God, look out into the beauties of nature and comfort yourself with that which must be. Love demands everything. We shall soon surely see each other. My heart is full of many things to say to you. Ah, there are moments when I feel that speech is nothing after all. Cheer up, remain my true, my only treasure, my all as I am yours. Your faithful Ludwig." The second and much briefer letter is dated evening Monday, July 6th, and ends, "O God, so near, so far, is our love not truly a celestial edifice, firm as heaven's vault?" The third letter, "Good morning, on July 7th. Though still in bed, my thoughts go out to you, meine unsterbliche Geliebte, my immortal beloved. Now and then joyfully, then sadly, waiting to learn whether or not fate will hear us. I can live only wholly with you, or not at all. Yes, I am resolved to wander so long away from you until I can fly to your arms and say that I am really at home, Send my soul enwrapped in you into the land of spirits. O God, why is it necessary to part from one whom one so loves? And yet my life in Vienna is now a wretched life. Your love makes me at once the happiest and the unhappiest of men. At my age I need a steady, quiet life. Be calm. Only by a calm consideration of our existence can we achieve our purpose to live together. Be calm, love me, today, yesterday. What tearful longings for you. My life, my all, farewell. Oh, continue to love me. Never misjudge the most faithful heart of your beloved L. Ever thine, ever mine, ever for each other. Who was she? No one knows. The pundits are divided, chiefly between the Countess Guicciardi-Gallenberg and the Countess Therese von Brunswick. Nothing short of a countess would do. Apparently the lady was married. If so, Beethoven, in wooing her, was forgetting the excellent principle he had professed to the Bigots. However, the letters were not sent. No harm was done, and music may have profited. 5. Beethoven and Goethe, 1809 to 1812. In 1809, Austria was again at war with France. In May, French cannonballs were dropping on Vienna. Court and nobility fled. Beethoven sought refuge in a cellar. The city surrendered. The victors taxed the commonalty 1/10 of a year's income, the well-to-do 1/3. Beethoven paid, but from a safe distance shook his fist at a patrolling Gaul and cried, "If I as a general knew as much about strategy as I the composer know about counterpoint, I'd give you something to do." Otherwise, the period from 1809 to 1815 shows Beethoven in relatively good spirits. In those years he often visited the home of Franz Brentano, prosperous merchant and patron of art and music, who sometimes helped Ludwig with a loan. Franz's wife, Antonia, was at times confined to her room with illness. More than once, during such spells, Beethoven came in quietly, played the piano, then left without a word, having spoken to her in his own language. On one such occasion he was surprised, as he played, by hands placed upon his shoulders. Turning, he found a young woman, then 25, pretty, her eyes glowing with pleasure over his playing, even over his singing, to his own music, Goethe's famous lyric about Italy, "Kennst du das Land?" She was Elisabeth Bettina Brentano, sister to Franz, and to the Clemens Brentano whom we shall meet as a famous German author. She herself was later to produce a number of successful books presenting autobiography and fiction in a now inextricable mixture. She is our only authority for the story just told, and for the later episode in which, at a party in Franz's home, she heard Beethoven discourse not only profoundly, but with an order and elegance not generally ascribed to him, though sometimes appearing in his letters. On May 28, 1810, she wrote enthusiastically about him to Goethe, whom she knew not merely through neighborly relations with his family in Frankfurt, but through a visit with him in Weimar. Some excerpts from this famous letter. "When I saw him of whom I shall now speak to you, I forgot the whole world. It is Beethoven of whom I now wish to tell you, and who made me forget the world and you. He stalks far ahead of the culture of mankind. Shall we ever overtake him? I doubt it, but grant that he may live until the enigma lying in his soul is fully developed. Then surely he will place the key to his heavenly knowledge in our hands." He himself said, "When I open my eyes I must sigh, for what I see is contrary to my religion, and I must despise the world which does not know that music is a higher revelation than wisdom and philosophy, the wine which inspires one to new generative processes. And I am the Bacchus who presses out this glorious wine for mankind and makes them spiritually drunken. I have no fear for my music. It can meet no evil fate. Those who understand it must be freed by it from all the miseries which the others drag about with them. Music is the mediator between intellectual and sensuous life. I should like to talk to Goethe about this. Would he understand me? Speak to Goethe about me. Tell him to hear my symphonies, and he will say that I am right in saying that music is the one incorporeal entrance into the higher world of knowledge." Bettina transmitted to Goethe these raptures of Beethoven, and added, "Rejoice me now with a speedy answer. which shall show Beethoven that you appreciate him." Goethe replied on June 6, 1810, "Your letter, heartily beloved child, reached me at a happy time. You have been at great pains to picture for me a great and beautiful nature in its achievements and its striving. I feel no desire to contradict what I can grasp of your hurried explosion. On the contrary, I should prefer for the present to admit an agreement between my nature and that which is recognizable in these manifold utterances. The ordinary human mind might perhaps find contradictions in it, but before that which is uttered by one possessed of such a demon, an ordinary layman must stand in reverence. Give Beethoven my heartiest greetings, and tell him that I would willingly make sacrifices to have his acquaintance. You may be able to persuade him to make a journey to Carlsbad, whither I go nearly every year, and would have the greatest leisure to listen to him and learn from him." Beethoven was unable to get to Carlsbad, but the two supreme artists of their time met at Teplitz, a watering place in Bohemia, in July 1812. Goethe visited Beethoven's lodgings there and gave a first impression in a letter to his wife. "A more self-centered, energetic, sincere artist I never saw. I can understand right well how singular must be his attitude toward the world." On July 21st and 23rd he spent the evenings with Beethoven, who, he reported, played delightfully. Familiar the story how, on one of their walks together, there came towards them the whole court, the Empress of Austria and the dukes. Beethoven said, "Keep hold of my arm. They must make room for us, not we for them." Goethe was of a different opinion, and the situation became awkward for him. He let go of Beethoven's arm and took a stand at the side with his hat off, while Beethoven, with folded arm, walked right through the dukes and only tilted his hat slightly while the dukes stepped aside to make room for him, and all greeted him pleasantly. On the other side he stopped and waited for Goethe, who had permitted the company to pass by him where he stood with bowed head. "Well," Beethoven said, "I've waited for you because I honor and respect you as you deserve, but you did those yonder too much honor." This was Beethoven's account, according to Bettina, who adds, "Afterward Beethoven came running to us and told us everything." We do not have Goethe's account. Perhaps we should be skeptical, too, about the story, variously and inconsistently related, that when Goethe expressed vexation at interruptions of their conversation by greetings from passers-by, Beethoven answered him, "Do not let them trouble, Your Excellency. Perhaps the greetings are intended for me." Dubious as they sound, both stories harmonize with authentic expressions in which the two geniuses summarized their meetings. On August 9th, Beethoven wrote to his Leipzig publishers, Breitkopf and Hertel, "Goethe is too fond of the atmosphere of the court, more so than is becoming to a poet." On September 2nd, Goethe wrote to Karl Zelter, "I made Beethoven's acquaintance in Teplitz. His talent amazed me. Unfortunately, he is an utterly untamed personality, not altogether in the wrong in holding the world to be detestable, but who does not make it any the more enjoyable either for himself or for others by his attitude. He is very excusable, on the other hand, and much to be pitied, as his hearing is leaving him, which perhaps mars the musical part of his nature less than the social. He is of a laconic nature, and will become doubly so because of this lack." 6. The Last Victories, 1811 to 1824. Wherever he went, he composed. In 1811 he gave final form to Opus 97 in B-flat, a trio for piano, violin, and violoncello, and dedicated it to the Archduke Rudolph, whence its name. It is one of his brightest, clearest, cleanest works, least confused by profusion, almost statuesque in its organic form. His last appearance as a performer was at the piano in a presentation of this classic in April 1814. He was now so deaf that he had lost the proper adjustment of hand and pedal pressure to musical intent. Some of the fortissimi drowned out the strings, while some pianissimi were inaudible. In May 1812, while Napoleon was massing 500,000 men for death in Russia, Beethoven issued his 7th Symphony, which, less often performed, seems now to wear better than the 5th or the 6th. Here is a somber dirge for lost greatness and shattered hopes. and here too is tenderness for fading but cherished loves, and a quest for understanding and peace. As its funeral march was an unwitting 1812 overture to Napoleon's disaster in Moscow, so its premiere, on December 8, 1813, was contemporary with the collapse of Napoleon's power in Germany and Spain. The enthusiastic reception of this symphony gladdened for a time the aging pessimist, who continued to produce masterpieces that for him had to be like those on Keats's Grecian urn, ditties of no tone. The Eighth Symphony, written in October 1812, first performed on February 27, 1814, was not so well received. The master had relaxed and had decided to be playful. It did not quite accord with the mood of a nation watching its fate daily hanging on the fortunes of war. But now we may delight in the jolly, prancing scherzando, whose persistent punctuation apparently made fun of a recent invention, the metronome. The most successful of Beethoven's compositions was Die Schlacht von Vittoria, offered in Vienna on December 8, 1813, to celebrate the battle in which Wellington had definitely destroyed French power in Spain. The news brought tardy satisfaction to the Austrian capital, which had been repeatedly humiliated by the apparently invincible Corsican. Now, for the first time, Beethoven became really famous in his adopted city. The music, we are told, hardly deserved its triumph. Die Schlacht war schlecht. Its subject and success made Beethoven popular with the dignitaries who, in 1814, attended the Congress of Vienna. The composer forgivably took the opportunity to organize a benefit concert for himself. The imperial court, resplendent with victory, offered him the use of its spacious Redoutensaal. Beethoven sent personal invitations to the notables of the Congress. 6,000 persons attended, and Beethoven was enabled to hide a substantial sum to cushion his future and his nephews. On November 11, 1815, his brother Karl died, after bequeathing a small sum to Ludwig and appointing him co-guardian with the widow of an 8-year-old son, Karl. From 1815 to 1826, Beethoven carried on in letters and the courts a searing contest with widow Theresia for control of Karl's movements, education, and soul. Theresia had brought Karl Sr. a dowry and a house, but had lapsed into adultery. She confessed to her husband, who forgave her. Beethoven never forgave her, and considered her unfit to guide Karl's development. We shall not follow that quarrel in its wearing length and sordid details. In 1826, Karl, torn between mother and uncle, tried to kill himself. Beethoven finally acknowledged the failure of his loving rigor. Karl recovered, joined the army, and took care of himself reasonably well. With the year 1817, Beethoven passed into the final period of his creative life. Long a revolutionist in private politics, he now made open war against classic norms, welcomed the Romantic movement into music, and gave to the sonata and the symphony a looser structure that subordinated the old rules to a rampant freedom of emotional and personal expression. Something of the wild spirit that had spoken in France through Rousseau and the Revolution, in Germany through Sturm und Drang, in young Goethe's Werther's Leiden, and young Schiller's Die Räuber, then in the poems of Tieck and Novalis, in the prose of the Schlegels, in the philosophies of Fichte and Schelling. Something of all this came down to Beethoven, and found rich soil in his natural emotionalism and individualistic pride. An old system of law, convention, and restraint collapsed in art as in politics, leaving the resolute individual free to express or embody his feelings and desires in a joyful bursting of old rules, bonds, and forms. Beethoven mocked the masses as asses, the nobles as impostors, their conventions and courtesies as irrelevant to artistic creation. He refused to be imprisoned in molds fashioned by the dead, even by such melodious dead as Bach and Handel, Haydn and Mozart and Gluck. He made his own revolution, even his own terror, and made his Ode to Joy a declaration of independence even in expectation of death. The three Hammerklavier sonatas formed a bridge between the second period and the third. Even their name was a revolt. Some angry Teutons, tired of Italian domination in the language and income of music, had proposed using German instead of Italian words for musical notations and instruments. So the majestic pianoforte should discard that Italian word for low and strong, and be called Hammerklavier, since the tones were produced by little hammers striking strings. Beethoven readily accepted the idea and wrote Sigmund Steiner, manufacturer of musical instruments, on January 13, 1817, instead of pianoforte, Hammerklavier, which settles the matter once for all. The most remarkable of the Hammerklavier sonatas is the second, Opus 106, in B-flat, written in 1818-19 as a Grosse Sonata für das Hammerklavier. Beethoven told Czerny that it was to remain his greatest piece for the piano, and this judgment has been confirmed by pianists in every succeeding generation. It seems to express a somber resignation to old age, illness, and a darkening solitude, and yet it is a triumph of art over despair. It was in further rejection of such despondency that Beethoven wrote the Ninth Symphony. He began work on it in 1818, concurrently with the Missa Solemnis, which was to be performed at the installation of Archduke Rudolf as Archbishop of Olmütz. The Mass was finished first, in 1823, 3 years too late for the installation. Anxious to add to the little hoard that he had accumulated as a refuge against old age and as a bequest to nephew Karl, Beethoven conceived the notion of selling subscriptions for pre-publication copies of his Mass. He sent invitations to this effect to the sovereigns of Europe, asking from each of them 50 ducats in gold. Acceptances came in slowly, but by 1825 10 had come. From the rulers of Russia, Prussia, France, Saxony, Tuscany, the princes Golitsyn and Radziwill, and the Cecilia Association of Frankfurt. The Missa Solemnis is generally held to have justified its long gestation and the strange bartering of its finished form. There is no trace in it of the occasional blasphemies that interrupted his inherited Catholic faith. Each moment of the liturgy is interpreted with concordant music, and through it all is audible the dying man's desperate faith, written by him in the manuscript score at the outset of the Credo. God above all, God has never deserted me. The music is too powerful to be an expression of Christian humility, but the dedicated concentration of each part and phrase and the sustained majesty of the whole make the Missa Solemnis the fit and final offering of a great flawed spirit to an incomprehensible God. In February 1824 he completed the Ninth Symphony. Here his struggle to express his final philosophy, the joyful acceptance of man's fate, broke through all the trammels of classic order, and the impetuous monarch let the pride of his power carry him to massive exaltations that sacrificed the old god order to the young god liberty. In the profusion of shattered altars, the themes that should have stood out as pillars to the edifice disappeared from all but esoteric view. The phrases seemed unduly insistent and repeated. An occasional moment of tenderness or calm was overwhelmed by a sudden fortissimo flung as if in rage at a mad and unresponsive world. Not so, a great scholar replies. There is, in this apparent embarrassment of riches, an extreme simplicity of form, underlying an elaboration of detail which may at first seem bewildering until we realize that it is purely the working out, to its logical conclusions, of some ideas as simple and natural as the form itself. Perhaps the master deliberately abandoned the classic effort to give lasting form to mortal beauty or veiled significance. He confessed his surrender and frolicked in the unregulated wealth of his imagination and the lavished resources of his art. In the end, he recaptured some flair of youthful defiance and enshrined in music that ode of Schiller's, which was not really to mere joy, but rather to joyful war against despotism and inhumanity. Fronting kings in manly spirit, though it cost us wealth and blood, crowns to naught save noblest merit, death to all the liar's brood. With his culminating masterpieces now complete, Beethoven longed for an opportunity to present them to the public. But Rossini had so captivated Austria in 1823, and Viennese audiences were now so enamored of Italian melody, that no local impresario dared risk a fortune on two compositions so difficult as the Missa Solemnis and the Choral Symphony. A Berlin producer offered to present them. Beethoven was about to agree when a combination of music lovers, led by the Lichnowsky family, Alarmed at the thought of Vienna's outstanding composer being forced to go to a rival capital for the premiere of his latest and most prestigious works, agreed to underwrite their production at the Kärntnertor Theatre. After hard bargaining on all sides, the concert was given on May 7, 1824, before a crowded house and with a stoic program. An overture, the consecration of the house, 4 parts of the Missa Solemnis, and the Ninth Symphony, with a stentorian German chorus to crown it all. The singers, unable to reach the high notes prescribed, omitted them. The Mass was received solemnly, the symphony with enthusiastic acclaim. Beethoven, who had been standing on the platform with his back to the audience, did not hear the applause and had to be turned around to see it. 7. Commedia Finita, 1824 to 1827. He quarreled with Schindler and other friends about the small share, 420 florins, they gave him of the 2,200 taken at the concert. He charged them with cheating him. They left him solitary now, except for the occasional presence of his nephew, whose attempted suicide in 1826 topped the inspired bear's cup of grief. It was in those years that he wrote the last 5 of his 16 quartets. The spark for these labors had come in 1823 from the offer of Prince Nikolai Golitsyn to pay any sum demanded for 1, 2, or 3 quartets to be dedicated to him. Beethoven agreed for 50 ducats each. Those 3, opuses 127, 130, and 132, and opuses 131 and 135, constitute the terminal quartets whose mysterious strangeness has ensured their fame. Opus 130 was privately played in 1826 to the avowed delight of the listeners, except that the performers found the 4th movement beyond their powers. Beethoven wrote a simpler finale. The rejected movement is now offered as Grosse Fuge, Opus 133, which a Beethoven scholar bravely interprets as expressing the composer's final philosophy. Life and reality are composed of inseparable opposites, good and evil, joy and sorrow, health and sickness, birth and death, and wisdom will adjust itself to them as the inescapable essence of life. Most highly praised of the 5, and considered by Beethoven to be his greatest quartet, is Opus 131 in C-sharp minor, finished on August 7, 1826. Here, we are told, the mystical vision is most perfectly sustained. Heard again recently, it seemed to be a long, weird wail, the pitiful moaning of a mortally wounded animal. The last of the 5, Opus 135, states a motto for its final movement. Muss es sein? Must it be? And gives the answer, Es muss sein. On December 2nd, 1826, racked by a tearing cough, Beethoven asked for a doctor. 2 of his former physicians refused to come. A third, Dr. Wawruk, came and diagnosed pneumonia. Beethoven took to his bed. His brother Johann came to watch over him. Nephew Karl, with Beethoven's blessing, left at the call of the army. On January 11th, Dr. Wawruk was joined by Dr. Malfatti. He prescribed frozen punch to help the patient sleep. Beethoven relished the liquor in it and abused the prescription. Dropsy and jaundice developed. Urine collected in Beethoven's body instead of being excreted. Twice he was tapped to release the fluid. He compared himself to a geyser. Resolved to make no use of the bank shares, totaling 10,000 florins, which he had hidden for Karl, and faced by rapidly rising expenses, Beethoven wrote on March 6, 1827, to Sir George Smart of London, "What is to become of me? What am I to live on until I have recovered my lost strength and can again earn my living by means of my pen? I beg you to exert all your influence to induce the Philharmonic Society to carry out their former decision to give a concert for my benefit. My strength is not equal to saying anything more." The Society sent him £100 as an advance on the receipts of the proposed concert. By March 16th, the physicians agreed that Beethoven had not long to live. They and brother Johann asked his consent to summoning a priest. "I wish it," he answered. His occasional bouts with God had been forgotten. His letter of March 14th shows him ready to accept whatever God in his divine wisdom might decree. On March 23rd, he received the last sacrament, apparently in a docile mood. His brother later reported that the dying man had said to him, I thank you for this last service." Soon after the ceremony, Beethoven said to Schindler, "Commedia finita est," referring apparently not to the religious service, but to life itself. The phrase was used in the classic Roman theater to announce the end of the play. He died on March 26, 1827, after 3 months of suffering. A few moments before his death, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a sharp clap of thunder. Aroused, Beethoven raised his right arm and shook his clenched fist, apparently at the storm. Soon thereafter, his agony ended. We shall never know what that last gesture meant. The post-mortem examination revealed the complex of internal disorders that had darkened his life and his temper. The liver was shrunken and diseased. The arteries of the ears were clogged with fatty particles, and the auditory nerves were degenerated. The pains in the head, indigestion, colic, and jaundice, of which he frequently complained, and the deep depression which gives the key to so many of his letters, would all follow naturally from the chronic inflammation of the liver and the digestive derangements to which it would give rise. Probably his love of walking and the open air had moderated these ailments and had given him most of the painless hours in his life. His funeral was attended by 30,000 persons. Hummel, the pianist, and Kreutzer, the violinist, were among the pallbearers. Schubert, Czerny, and Grillparzer were among the torchbearers. The tombstone bore only the name Beethoven and his dates of birth and death.